think we can start now, Dr. Mayaki.
Okay. Okay. So I don't have to wait for you. But anyway. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Let me start by thanking for joining the difficult circumstances. I would like to thank very warmly the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific for co-hosting this event with us. No country has been spared from the pandemic. For Asian countries, the crisis has resulted in tax revenues and increasing expenses on health and social protection measures. And going forward, far more resources will be needed to support a durable recovery and to achieve the 2030 agenda. At the same time, sufficient financial accountability, transparency, and integrity erodes the ability of governments to raise revenue, resulting in a drain of necessary resources from investment in sustainable development, even before COVID-19 pandemic. Widespread challenges from cross-border corruption, money laundering, and tax abuses threaten government's ability to finance our 2030 agenda. Against this background, the 74th President of the United Nations General Assembly and the 75th President of the United Nations Economic and Social Council established the High-level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda, the FACTI Panel, with a view to contributing to the overall efforts undertaken by UN member states to curb the drain of resources and to build a strong and resilient financial system. This initiative is even more relevant in the light of the current crisis, more than ever before. Time has come to step up our collective efforts to stop the drain of resources. In the panel's interim report, published in September, we identified the major gaps, impediments, and vulnerabilities in the international legal and institutional frameworks for financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. These gaps in the current system are not isolated. They represent systemic shortcomings in the current arrangements. They require systemic responses. Better global coordination is therefore required. We need inclusive and sustainable participation by all nations, both from North and South, at this moment in time. Member states need to show willingness to agree on new solutions. The private sector, civil society, and the media will also evidently contribute towards these efforts. This is the reason we organized this virtual regional consultation today, which is among a series of meetings that will take place throughout the month, but also includes Europe, Africa, and Latin America and Caribbean. Excellencies, in pursuing our efforts, the FACTI panel can light on the path, but you must walk the path. In this respect, the panel would like to hear from leaders in Asia-Pacific region on your preferred means to address the shortcomings in the existing frameworks. The aim is to develop political consensus on joint actions by the international community to promote financial accountability transparency, and integrity across all three areas of a panel's work, including cooperation in tax matters, accountability, public reporting and anti-corruption, and international cooperation and settling disputes. In particular, we want to hear your views of us on what are the three priority areas in your view to enhance financial integrity in the post-COVID world and ensure sufficient financing for response and recovery. Point 2, international tax norms previously agreed at the OECD are currently under renegotiation. What roles do you see for both the OECD and the UN in ensuring universal and inclusive international tax cooperation, given the array of existing arrangements and institutions? And point 3, what are barriers to better accessibility of financial ownership information? Point 4, finally, is about the volume of asset returns that accounts for only a tiny fraction of the proceeds of corruption laundered worldwide. What innovative, concrete, and balanced solutions could be adopted to accelerate the recovery and ensure effective, accountable, and transparent return of assets? Your inputs will feed into the FACTI panel's determination of technically feasible and politically viable recommendations to be made in its final report, which will be published in February 2021. You can also send your ideas in writing to us by the end of November, and we welcome this. Also note that the recording of this meeting will be available on our FACTI panel website and the United Nations Web TV platform after the meeting. At this time, I would like to hand over to the co-host of this event, Executive Secretary Armida Salcia Alish Bana of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, for her opening remarks. Mrs. Armida Salcia, ESCAP Executive Secretary, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, FACTI Panel Co-Chair, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to address the high-level Asia-Pacific Regional Consultation towards an ecosystem of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. I'm pleased to co-host this regional consultation with a high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 Agenda. Global economic and financial ties extend beyond national borders. Maintaining a healthy ecosystem of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity is increasingly a shared policy priority across the regions. Taxation issues are now part of a multilateral policy landscape. With the emergence of digital economy and web-based business models, these are new challenges related to the core principles of taxation and the fair allocation of tax base across countries and jurisdictions. Furthermore, increasingly complex financial transactions and cross-border illicit financial flows remains a key constraint in mobilizing development financing. With the ever-growing requirements of development financing to meet the aspiration of the 2030 Agenda, The interim report of the High-level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity for Achieving the 2030 Agenda provides a timely opportunity for governments and policymakers to ensure accountability, transparency, and integrity in our financial system. In the Asia-Pacific region, it is estimated to account for some 40% of global illicit financial flows, mostly in the form of trade misinvoicing. ESCAP research suggests that more than 6% of total regional tax revenue could have been lost in this form alone, amounting to nearly about 200 billion US dollar a year. In comparison, the global net official development assistance and official aid in 2018 was just about 165 billion US dollar. To date, Asia and Pacific effort in addressing this challenge has concentrated on multilateral tax cooperation, especially through its participation at the main international tax cooperation platforms. The region is also taking part in the ongoing initiatives to reform the current global tax governance architecture for minimizing tax avoidance and evasion. Notably, ESCAP organized 4 consecutive high-level regional dialogues on financing for development in Asia and the Pacific during the period 2014 until 2017, with tax cooperation as one of the key aspects of this deliberation. In 2019, ESCAP further mainstreamed the tax cooperation discussion into its intergovernmental conference structure as part of our Committee on Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development. In this regard, ESCAP continues to serve as a regional platform to communicate insights and ideas to the global UN processes and share global knowledge and good practices with policymakers in the region. Allow me now to highlight 3 policy areas for your further reflections and deliberation. First, developing countries are inadequately represented and supported in the ongoing international taxation reform and tax cooperation initiatives. Even for developing countries already participating on a procedural quote at equal footing, they often lack the human resource and technical expertise to effectively articulate the complex reform proposals and their own interests in related tax negotiations. Second, the regional tax cooperation framework has been highly fragmented and inadequate in Asia and the Pacific. In contrast to, for example, Latin America, Africa, and developing transitional Europe, the Asia-Pacific region remains the only region without a region-wide mature tax cooperation platform that has broad membership, is well-funded, and has sufficient in-house capacity for closer to the ground policy coordination and support. Third, the cooperation and agenda have yet to move beyond taxation issues and to address financial accountability, transparency, and integrity as well. Tackling tax evasion and avoidance and boosting public revenues for development financing is only one part of the policy agenda. There is a growing call to include policy issues such as fighting corruption, stopping illegal capital flight, or promoting economic equality and responsible business and investment in the sustainable financing agenda. I welcome the important and seminal work of the FACTI panel and its interim report aiming to analyze the gaps, vulnerabilities, and impediments in the current international systems related to financial accountability, transparency, and integrity issues. This is even more significant as member states are focusing on addressing the COVID-19 crisis that would require increased level of government financing to protect people's lives and financing the economic recovery. I look forward to the new policy ideas and suggestions to be inspired by the findings of the FACTI interim report and to emerge from this Asia-Pacific regional consultation. ESCAP stands ready to move forward the recommendations as appropriate for our region in building back better and advance the sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Executive Secretary Ali Shabana, for your insights, your very pertinent remarks, and the 3 points that you highlighted as recommendations that we should look at. Thank you very much. I will now invite His Excellency Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, Advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Finance and Revenue, for a keynote speaking. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Good afternoon. My name is Amir Gondal. I'm joined from Ministry of Finance. As we informed that due to certain scheduling difficulties, the advisor has not been able to join us so far. He's in the Prime Minister's office. So I would request that Mr. Shahid Hafiz Kardar, former Governor of State Bank of Pakistan, would make comments on behalf of Government of Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you. Thank
you. Good evening. Hello, do I have the floor? This is Ambassador of Pakistan in Bangkok.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Executive Secretary of ESCAP, my special greetings and very warm regards to Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Mayaki, former Prime Minister of Niger. I would just like to recall on a personal note that as a young diplomat, my first diplomatic assignment was in Niamey, Niger, way back in 1997. And at that time, Your Excellency was the Prime Minister, and I had the great honor of learning a lot from you, your great wisdom and la sagesse that you have on the development issues. So thank you so much. I think it's great that you are co-chairing this panel. It is my honor to represent Mr. Abdul Hafiz Sheikh, Advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Finance and Revenue, and I would like to make the following remarks on his behalf. Each year, billions of dollars flow out of the developing countries in illicit financial flows, severely damaging their ability to invest in their own development and to achieve the sustainable development goals. We welcome the interim report of the FACTI panel. The figures of illicit flows mentioned in the report are just staggering. $1 trillion are taken out each year by criminals. $20 to $40 billion are in the form of bribes received by the corrupt. $7 trillion in stolen assets are parked in haven countries. $500 to $600 billion are lost each year in tax avoidance by multinational companies around the world. Excellencies, during the recent high-level event for the launch of the interim report of the panel, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Imran Khan, had urged the international community to take decisive actions to stop bleeding of poor developing countries. Pakistan is a major victim of such illicit financial transfers by the corrupt and the criminals. The amount of Pakistan's stolen assets stashed abroad runs into billions of dollars because of this plundering. We have taken several steps at home to strengthen our financial regulatory regime. However, our national efforts must be complemented by international cooperation. We urge that the stolen assets of developing countries, including the proceeds of corruption, bribery, and other crimes, must be returned forthwith by the countries where such stolen assets have been transferred, without conditions or other legal or technical obstacles that are sometimes there. The authorities in such haven countries must impose criminal and financial penalties on their financial institutions which receive and utilize such money or assets which are not proven to have been legally earned, or assets and money which have been transferred for the purposes of tax evasion or avoidance. The enablers of corruption and bribery, such as accountants, lawyers, and other intermediaries, must be closely regulated, monitored, and held accountable. To minimize corruption, the beneficial ownership of foreign companies must be revealed immediately upon inquiry by the interested governments or their authorities. It is also essential to adopt international measures that would prevent multinational corporations from resorting to profit shifting to low-tax jurisdictions to avoid taxation. A global minimum corporate tax could prevent this practice, in our view. Similarly, revenues from digital transactions should be taxed where the revenues have been generated and not elsewhere. Developing countries are penalized by unequal investment treaties, and this has been our experience. These should be revised and a fair system set up for adjudication of investment disputes. For example, a $6 billion award to compensate for a $300 million investment has been termed as mugging by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. All official and non-official bodies set up to control and monitor illicit financial flows must include the concerned countries. Such mechanisms should not be used for financial coercion. We believe that, as suggested in the FACTI panel, the UN should set up a mechanism to coordinate and supervise the work of the various official and non-official bodies dealing with illicit financial flows to ensure coherence, consistency, and equity in their work. We hope these proposals will be considered and adopted by the FACTI panel and the United Nations. Excellencies, the recession triggered by COVID-19 pandemic has made it all the more important for the developing countries to protect and preserve their resources so vital for their development needs. We believe a systemic response and a global political consensus, as recommended by the FACTI Panel report, will help achieve this objective. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And as you know, you are welcome in Niger anytime. Thank you very much. Okay, so let me now invite Mr. Richard Ian Wagstaff, the President of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. Over to you, Mr. President.
View on this matter from New Zealand. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'll continue. For too long and in too many countries, including New Zealand, Labour has borne the brunt of taxation. And we absolutely have no problem with paying our taxes. Taxes are the price of a civilised society. Taxes are the way everyone receives healthcare, education, clean water, and most recently in New Zealand, a response to COVID that has kept many of us alive and our economy functioning. But we shouldn't have to do it alone. The union movement calls for capital and business and high wealth individuals to pay their fair share too. They also reap the benefits of public services, of roads, of the justice system, and so on, as much as workers do. We want to see globally, firstly, a 25% corporate tax rate, although New Zealand, we want to keep our 28% one, based on the global profits of the company and apportioned to where it actually does its business, not just where the structuring puts the income. Secondly, we want to see a wealth tax. So few people have wealth in our world, and all too often their income is not taxed as it is earned. Wealth provides huge safety value and support. So let's tax that, not just the income from people's labour. Thirdly, a digital tax. The current rules for taxing tech companies just aren't working. It's time to try a different angle to make sure they pay their fair share. Fourthly, all governments need to implement a financial transactions tax to counter speculative flows and provide another source of revenue for countries wanting to rebuild their economies. Fifth, greater transparency for companies' financial dealings and greater transparency and accountability of government and how they conduct their tax investigations and collection. Sixth, tripartite structures to oversee the management of government funds. Seventh, protection of whistleblowers who are essential in exposing tax evasion and corruption and are often at risk of losing their jobs and in some countries their freedoms and even their lives. And finally, while we are supportive of the work being undertaken by the OECD and their base erosion and profit shifting, the union movement would also like the UN to take an effective lead to ensure governance on taxation matters at a global level based on their reinvigorated commitment to multilateralism. Tax, not austerity, is the way forward to fund the recovery and rebuild the social contract and ensure resilience against future global shock. Taxing the pandemic profiteers and breaking up the global monopolies of the big tech companies is vital to shared prosperity, without which the world cannot build peace and security. Thank you for this opportunity. I hope this contribution adds to your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Wagstaff. And I would like to thank our two keynote speakers for their valuable remarks, which I'm sure will be taken into account by the panel. I would like to see if any of our FACTI panel members would like to briefly respond to the points which were by the keynote speakers. And I would like to invite Mr. Shahid Hafiz Kardar, the Vice Chancellor of Beacon House National University of Pakistan, and FACTI panel members. Mr. Shahid,
I'm just going to raise three questions, in fact, to the panel. One, when we refer to the need to look at tax avoidance and tax evasion, and then talk in terms of having a minimum tax, just to remind ourselves, which is pillar 2 of the OECD proposals, BPS. Let us not forget that tax avoidance policies have been implemented in several countries already. So in a sense, when you start talking about the apportionment of profits, it's not going to be as simple as we all think in terms when we look at global profits. The second area I want to highlight, I know everyone talks about digital taxation, so it's just a question to ourselves. What do you do? Do we start a principle of taxation based on a line of business? Imagine you and I were to buy a shirt from Ralph Lauren, and that would be treated differently if I were to buy the same shirt from Amazon. So in a sense, the more sensible approach, to me at least, and it's the question, whether you should be looking at global profits of all M&Es, irrespective of their line of business. So I mean, in a sense, then we're treating everyone similarly. The third area I want to highlight is something which may have been missed at the moment, is to look at this whole question of high denomination notes, because that facilitates corruption and bribery. Secondly, this whole question of bearer instruments of exchange needs to be addressed. Beneficial ownership is much more a problem of developed countries, and I can go on as to how it can be addressed, but I'm just raising it, that this is something which requires a public viewing, a public availability of information, and so that is something. Finally, what we need is a clearer criteria for evaluation of systems and processes, for peer reviews, and really, people haven't dwelt upon it, but I think it was at the back of their minds, that a greater transparency of country by country reports, and that they should be made public. The reason I'm emphasizing all this is I think a lot of information today is made available. There need to be penalties for not making that information available on a timely basis. There must be some penalties, in my view. The systems exist today for those, and we need to look at that. Finally, there has been a reference to tax havens. Let me just highlight two very interesting studies, and I'll stop here. A recent study, as recent as November 2020, by the Institute for Economic Research by the University of Munich is interesting. They looked at all German multinationals with revenues in excess of 750 million euros. It is interesting, less than 1%, barely 1% of them were actually have distribution of profits in tax havens other than tax havens in Europe. And only 7.6% of their total global profits were actually in tax havens of Europe. So in a sense, 92% of the reported taxes were actually not in tax havens. So we need to be much more careful when we talk of tax havens in general. And I think we need better understanding of tax havens, a better definition of tax havens. And I'll stop here because I think other people have much more to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, dear Shahid, for your very pertinent remarks and the questions that you raised. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Karim Daher, international business lawyer, member of the Anti-Corruption Committee of the Lebanese Ministry of Justice, and who is a FACTI panel member. Mr. Karim Daher, over to you.
I would like to say that several of the issues that have been raised during this consultation have been tackled by our FACTI panel. And what I would like to highlight and to stress on is the fact that our role, to remind that our role is not to duplicate or to propose rules and solutions that overlap existing ones, but rather to review the existing mechanism and improve the existing legal framework. And that's what has been done by our three clusters on the main topic that have been submitted with a view to enhance the international tax cooperation and explore further actions. Because we strongly believe that there is still room for improvement, and there is still room for improvement in the implementation and in inclusiveness. The wording that has been used during the beginning of this consultation is the same wording that has been used during all the workshops, the consultation that has been made before. And several issues have been tackled in the same way, and the same discrepancies and the same reservation between developing countries and developed countries still exist. But what I would like to highlight very quickly is that there are several issues that have been studied in depth for the first time by our panel, and I would like to give you very quickly a glimpse of those issues, like to generalize the exchange of information in order to help the developing and low-income countries, and to strengthen also the control of enablers in several countries, notably in the developing countries, the enablers that are the lawyers and the accountants, because the illicit financial flows is facilitated by the mission and what those enablers are implementing in their countries. And if we do not have a very strong sanction regime to deter the tax optimizations, I think that all what is proposed by now, but by our panel or has been proposed by other inclusive frameworks, will not go to the end, because we will still have vulnerabilities and we will still have loopholes and we still have gaps. And this is what's happening with the OECD's inclusive framework, the BEPS, or the exchange of informations with loopholes, with several other issues like the resident by investment scheme and other things. And what I would like also to highlight, that the refusal of complying or to go forward in this action is not only at the level of the developing or the low-income countries, because they do not have capabilities in order to follow or to be included in this framework, but also in several developed countries that are refraining to move forward with this international tax cooperation and international tax inclusive frameworks, because there are several advantages, and Shahid has already tackled these issues. There is also the tax avoidance that has been deeply discussed between us within the definition of the illicit financial flows, and whether we have to address this issue and consider, notwithstanding the fact that it is legal in some aspects, but if we have to address the tax avoidance because there is an unlawful tax competition, and this unlawful tax competition is depriving countries from having resources. And those are among the several other issues that have been discussed. Also the lack of capacity, the imbalances in participations in the framework between the developing countries and the developed countries. And for instance, we have provided an example that there are several developed countries, colonial countries, former colonial countries, they have their dependents. The votes in the OECDs and other similar organizations is not on equal footing. Thank you, Dr. Mayaki.
Thank you very much, Karim. I will thank my Shahid and Karim, and suggest we now move on to the discussion. For this, first, I would like to invite Mr. John Versant-Vort, the head of anti-corruption section of the Asian Development Bank. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Miyaki, and thank you, panelists of FACTI, for inviting our participation in today's discussion. I have to say that when I went through the interim report, I was very encouraged to see how much it resonates with our own findings at the Asian Development Bank. this year has for us really been a catalyst year in which we are putting considerable emphasis on the bank's role in combating illicit financial flows in Asia and the Pacific. And when the ESCAP Executive Secretary was summarizing some of the key impediments to fighting illicit financial flows, again, I found a lot that we recognize in what we have detected as we are looking at this issue. For one thing, the significant drain on developing country resources is clear. If you look at global financial integrity estimates, they think that the illicit flow of money out of the developing world reached 1.1 trillion in 2013 and has been increasing by around 6.5% per year since then. And being in Asia and the Pacific, from 2004 to 2013, Asia saw the most significant volume of illicit financial outflows, comprising 38.8% of the developing world total within the covered period. And these kind of outflows really threaten to derail progress towards achieving United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this is becoming all the more urgent now because of the pandemic. Our developing members are facing increased pressure on their budgets due to large-scale counter-cyclical expenditure programs, coupled with a decrease in revenues. And as a matter of fact, ADB expects that the economies of 33 out of our 46 developing members will contract this year. Another significant point mentioned by the ESCAP Executive Secretary is the absence of a pan-regional tax association in Asia. We had come to the same conclusion that this is something that needs to be remedied. Late last year, a new president assumed office in Asian Development Bank, President Asakawa Masatsuru, and he has a long-standing track record working against harmful tax practices, both as a former minister in the Japanese government as well as with the OECD. And under his leadership, ADB has decided to make the topic of domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation a key strategic priority for the bank. And specifically, what we want to achieve is to establish a regional hub, a pan-Asia Pacific regional hub on domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. And the reason that we mention both these topics together, domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation, is because we feel that countries will not be able to generate the revenues that will be necessary to get the Sustainable Development Goals back on track without more intense international tax cooperation. I think a key challenge with the area of international tax cooperation, and it's been mentioned already in the course of this discussion, is that tax is traditionally seen by many countries as a matter of sovereignty, and countries are generally reluctant to have their hands tied, including through international agreements. And we think this is a false choice, because stepping away from international tax cooperation for the sake of protecting sovereignty will only serve to erode sovereign powers by making base erosion, profit shifting, and tax evasion easier. We think that the failure to engage in international tax cooperation will result in unilateral tax measures by many governments, which can then lead to an increased chance of double or triple taxation, which would actually undermine cross-border trade and investments. So with this regional hub, we wish to address the lack or the current shortfall in international tax cooperation in Asia and the Pacific region. But we also want to address another element that was highlighted by other speakers before, is that the imbalanced participation of developing members in this dialogue on international tax cooperation. We feel that some of these standards are perhaps sometimes prioritize the interests of developed countries over those of developing countries. And we feel that by creating this regional hub and having the dialogue, not just dialogue where developing countries assume, study, adopt the international standard, but actually have a dialogue about thinking about what actually makes sense in the context of the developing countries is very important. And in this regional hub, we want to create opportunity for strategic policy dialogue, not just with international standard setters such as the OECD, the Global Forum, etc., but also among developing countries, which may be facing similar issues, similar difficulties, and could thereby learn from each other. We think, as the interim report has also noticed, the architecture for assisting with countries with combating illicit financial flows can be a bit fragmented, and we also want to create this regional hub in order to improve the collaboration and development coordination with such institutions as the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, etc., so that we can have a more coordinated approach in our development assistance to the countries in the region. And that brings me to a last point. I think when we develop country assistance, we need to be very cognizant, and this is again something why I loved reading the interim report, very cognizant of the country-specific circumstances. And there is no size fits all. So we feel that the best way of going about this is for each country to develop its medium-term revenue strategy, where it can focus on prioritizing those standards that give it most bang for the buck in tax reform, and then hopefully bring the region towards more convergence in their respective tax regimes. So let me stop there. And again, I wholeheartedly thank the panel for putting together a very relevant report and one that really resonates with ADB's strategic priorities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Versant-Vogt. And we are happy to see that there is a convergent analysis between what you highlighted as critical points and what the interim report is enhancing. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Robin Nge, Director of International Tax and Relations Division, Ministry of Finance, Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency. Good afternoon, Your Excellency and ladies and gentlemen. I am Robin Ng, Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore. It is my pleasure today to join you for the regional consultation. We welcome this opportunity to have an inclusive dialogue with the panel, given the importance of ensuring that the panel final report is a balance, takes into account the diversity of views among member states, and focuses on areas of consensus. The 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development calls on member states to 1. Significantly reduce illicit financial flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime. And 2. Strengthen the domestic resource mobilization, including through international support to developing countries to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenue collection. There are currently multiple multilateral mechanisms and platforms to review and address illicit financial flows and international taxation issues. These include the UN Convention Against Corruption, the Financial Action Task Force, the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information for Tax Purposes, and the Inclusive Framework on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. For instance, for taxation matters, the Global Forum and the Inclusive Framework on BEPS have more than 160 and 135 jurisdictions as members, respectively. And there's wide participation from both developed and developing countries. These multilateral fora are involved in setting the internationally agreed tax standards and have mechanisms in place to regularly monitor and peer review them to ensure a level playing field across all jurisdictions. Other international organizations such as the UN, IMF, and the World Bank also participate in ongoing work at the Global Forum and the Inclusive Framework on BEPS and other similar fora. We are therefore of the view that the panel priority should be on collaborating with these existing multilateral bodies to complement their work. Where there are gaps, the panel should work with this body to address them in a manner that does not undermine or duplicate ongoing work being undertaken in other mechanisms and platforms. This will ensure a more coordinated and coherent approach to 1, help member states achieve the 2030 agenda, 2, strengthen efforts against illicit financial flows, and 3, update international tax rules in response to the changing international economy. We thank the Secretariat for putting together the issue notes for this session. We'd like to offer the following comments on them, which we hope the panel will take into account as it prepares its final report. On the issue note on architecture for tax cooperation, we agree that discussion on international tax matters should be undertaken in a globally coordinated and inclusive manner. Such discussions should take place and are already taking place within existing multilateral fora, such as the Global Forum and the Inclusive Framework on BEPS. We therefore do not find it useful or necessary to establish a new intergovernmental tax body. For instance, it is not clear what issue this new body could usefully address that are not already discussed in existing multilateral tax fora. If there are gaps or alternative views on specific issues, we believe that it will be more productive for the panel to refer them to the existing multilateral tax fora. The panel can also contribute to ongoing discussion at existing fora by exploring ways to better support developing countries' participation. For example, through capacity building efforts. On the issue note on taxation of the digitalizing economy, we support the work undertaken by the Inclusive Framework on BEPS to deliver a consensus-based, viable, long-term, and coordinated global solution. In this regard, the panel shall focus its resources on supporting the current work undertaken there. Short-term and unilateral measures to deal with the complex challenges may be attempting quick fixes, but we believe that they are ultimately counterproductive in establishing future-proof solutions to common challenges. They also increase uncertainty for businesses and hamper cross-border trade flows and economic growth. This is especially detrimental to countries struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. On the issue note on financial reporting and information exchange, we note the significant progress made by the Global Forum over the last 11 years in promoting the exchange of tax information and monitoring the implementation of the international standards or EOI. We believe that the robust peer reviews undertaken by the Global Forum have been effective in ensuring the consistent implementation of the internationally agreed standards by all jurisdictions and actors. The key principles underpinning the current EOI framework, such as reciprocity and putting in place safeguards to ensure the proper use and confidentiality of taxpayer information, have been the cornerstones in supporting the widespread adoption of the EOI standards internationally. In this regard, the panel should exercise due care and diligence to ensure that its proposals do not inadvertently erode the considerable progress made over the last decade on the exchange of information for tax purposes. On the issue note on beneficial ownership information, internationally agreed standards on beneficial ownership at both the Global Forum and FATF already require all countries to ensure availability of accurate and reliable beneficial ownership information. The standards also require that this information be accessible on a timely basis by law enforcement agencies, as well as for exchange of information requests between tax authorities. We also understand that there is ongoing work at the FATF to further clarify effective implementation of measures to promote transparency, which could involve further changes to the FATF standards in this area. It is therefore important that any work shall be done in close consultation with existing standard-setting bodies. It is also important that we remain cognizant that any proposal to make available beneficial ownership information publicly or to non-government persons invariably raises concerns of privacy, security, and the potential misuse of that information. This has to be carefully considered by the panel. On the issue note on addressing enablers, we recommend that the panel consider working through the existing standard-setting bodies, such as the FATF and the Global Forum, when considering changes to the standard. This is to ensure consistency in the application of standard across various reviews and platforms, with a view to forging convergence in understanding and application of cross-cutting issues as far as possible. Finally, on the issue note on international tax dispute settlement, we agree that tax certainty is an important component supporting and facilitating cross-border trade flows and economic growth. This is necessary in the current challenging economic environment. In this regard, we fully support the work undertaken by the UN Tax Committee on developing additional guidance on dispute prevention and resolution. We would encourage the panel to consider supporting further work in existing fora to help developing countries address the underlying concerns with mandatory binding arbitration and better articulate how adopting arbitration could facilitate the timely resolution of international tax disputes by competent authorities. In conclusion, I would like to thank the panel and the Secretariat for its efforts and work in advancing the objectives of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. We request that our comments be taken into account in the final report and look forward to continued engagement with the panel in the lead up to the release of the report in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robin Gay. We have duly taken note of your comments. I would like now to invite Mr. Faiz Hamad Al-Shayheri, Head of the Anti-Fraud Unit of the Ministry of Finance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Good afternoon, all excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really happy today to be with you in this exceptional discussion. And thanks to the participants and the previous speakers for their notes, as they have covered, many of the major points. It is definitely that the interim report presented some figures that need to be highlighted and considered as they are eye-catching. When looking at them from various different angles, especially when it comes to profit shifting and tax evasion and the amount of bribes here received. On the domestic level, we have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has set of laws and regulations combating financial crimes in general. This includes corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion. There are also ongoing and the new initiatives every now and then to minimize the risk of financial crimes on the sustainable development. The Ministry of Finance has taken serious steps recently in the last few years to make use of the new technology to combat financial crimes, as we have managed to develop let's say a platform called Atimat. This platform serves as an online platform for government entities and private sectors contractors providing services related to budget management, vendor selection and contracts, and payment management. Hamad has in place preventive and predictive controls right from the local laws and regulations, and definitely the international best practices. However, we are in agreement with the report. The report talked about, that the issue of lack of international accountability, transparency, and integrity is not a domestic issue; it's a global problem, which requires a global solution. Developing countries achieve the 2030 agenda. And definitely, this solution must be. There should be, some coherence, and there should be some consistency in this in terms of international financial accountability and transparency. As a result, we at the regional level, let's say initially, I think the regional community should consider, solutions such as, having, more international, more regional collaboration has to be achieved with regards to financial crimes in general. Definitely promoting the use of technology in detecting corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion is a must. And the efforts should be made, and there should be, sort of ways to enable the developing country to return the crime proceeds, and definitely sharing local and domestic experiences, and trying to make use of the existing, controls that we have in our developing countries is also a plus. And there should be, certain, regional hub for sharing experiences and trying to achieve, coherence and consistency in our, fight against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Faiz. Very pertinent comments that the panel will take into account. I would like now to invite Mr. Edwin Maria John, Director of Global Outreach, Neighborhood Community Network. Over to you, sir. Is Mr. Edwin Maria John present? Can the Secretariat check for me if he is present?
Yes, sure. Yes, he was present earlier, actually.
Okay. So if he's not present now,
probably you can move to the next one.
Yes,
Dr. Mayaki,
I will move. Yes, now I will invite Ms. Cynthia Gabriel, the Executive Director of the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism. Over to you, Ms. Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. Good evening from my side. I come from Malaysia, so the time is actually quite late in the evening already. But I wanted to really congratulate the panel for putting a very good report out on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. On my side, I found the report really very interesting. And one of the things I wanted to highlight here is we have and are still recovering from one of the biggest financial scandals that the world has seen today. It is the 1MDB scandal, which I think many of us have heard of. It also reflects many of the things that were spoken about in the Panama Papers. And we're looking at many challenges which are very new and very threatening, actually, not just to the financial situation, but to the economy, to political stability, and most of all to people's rights. And this is one of the things I wanted to highlight, that we've got new challenges like tax, which has been mentioned before, because we don't have a coordinated system. We have shell companies, which have been really increasingly difficult to track because of the sophisticated measures that are being used. Also, the use of offshore havens to hide loot and public funds, actually, from third world countries like ours, which actually had a very big impact on the economic stability and so on. So therein lies the problem that has been already touched on by previous speakers. We're talking about very sophisticated cross-border corruption, cross-border crimes that actually involve many stakeholders, from private sector to government, and to many persons who actually hold the positions of power and have money to play the game that we are all trying to manage and mitigate. But what really bothers me so much is the fact that a lot of these high-powered games really affect people the most. And I wanted to highlight that if it was not for investigative journalists and very strong institutions like the Department of Justice in the United States that actually uncovered the scandal in the very first beginnings before it actually snowballed into something really massive. It was these institutions that I believe the FACTI panel needs to protect, needs to promote the strength and the empowerment of journalists, investigative journalists, for example, whistleblowers and whistleblower protection, as well as looking at frameworks that exist that speaks very clearly of why these groups of people also need to be protected. I'm talking about processes that involve fast tracking of the UNCAC in the region, the UN Convention Against Corruption, which very clearly stipulates the need for private sector, government, and civil society to work together, of open government partnerships, and something very important that is actually coming up in the works that we all know about, which is the UNGAS, the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Corruption, which gives us a great opportunity to put on the table some of these very, very sensitive, difficult, and political issues that nations need to resolve. So I also wanted to just end by suggesting that one of the important things in this region or sub-region, for example, would involve, for example, within the ASEAN Economic Community, a real process that can be developed to monitor financial accountability, how greater transparency can be derived from many of the procurement processes that deal with cross-border engagements and cross-border procurements. How is it that complaints can be received if there are situations of malpractice or situations that warrant nations to pay attention to? Right now, the opaqueness, which directly targets SDG 16, where access to information becomes something which is of primary importance, can be incorporated into the panel's report, which I do hope will be considered, so that we'll be able to also empower people's and community movements to better track the need for strengthened financial accountability, transparency, and integrity in this part of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these very pertinent remarks that will help the panel pursue its work. Let me now invite Ms. Neti Biyani, Program Manager of the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. Over to you, Ms. Neti.
Thank you so much. Respected Chair, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, I speak on behalf of Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, New Delhi, and the Independent Working Group on Illicit Financial Flows of the Financial Transparency Coalition. We are witnessing transformation in the way tax-related illicit financial flows are being recognized as tax abuses by the FACTI panel and welcome the historic strides made in positioning tax abuse as a human rights issue. The United Nations and UN-led processes are democratic, inclusive, and rights-based, unlike other northern economic governance bodies. The financing for development process as well as the sustainable development goals were negotiated and agreed upon within the UN, with the first intergovernmental commitment to end all illicit financial flows under SDG goal 16.4.1. The modalities of addressing IFFs should now be developed within the ambit of the UN instead of other exclusionary, opaque, undemocratic bodies that do not represent interests of southern countries. The current financial governance architecture, including governance bodies, resolution mechanisms, international tax policies, and practices, is not aligned with the SDG agenda or human rights principles and frameworks. This inconsistency between the global financial system and human rights principles, such as representation, non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability, makes avenues for abuse large. The absence of any tangible multilateral processes in the Asia-Pacific in the FACTI panel's interim report makes it amply clear that low-income countries in this region will most likely be underrepresented and ultimately depend on exclusionary or undemocratic global voluntary processes. While the FACTI panel's interim report maps the dilution and limited implementation of systemic processes, it must also recognize that a majority of governmental and intergovernmental processes and institutions overly privilege corporate and business interests, not least by clearly establishing lobbying mechanisms through which business influences policymaking. This is happening parallelly with an increasing shrinking of civic space and civil society engagement with policymaking processes throughout the world. Thus, we implore the FACTI panel to take into account the role played by an efficient industry of facilitators of illicit financial flows, such as big accounting firms, law firms, offshore service providers, large banks, etc., whose role in feeding the underbelly of crime, corruption, and tax abuse has been made amply clear by various document leaks and investigative journalism in the past decade. My last point relates to the role of bilateral tax treaties that disproportionately harm developing countries. There is an absence of any intergovernmental governance of tax treaties, as they fall out of the ambit of the OECD-led BEPS process as well. Therefore, the UN has a crucial gap to fill in this context. Given the way the DTAs are generally negotiated, the residence country, which usually is a developed country or a tax haven, ends up receiving a larger chunk of taxing profits than the country in which economic value is actually created, which is usually a developing country. It is also common for TNCs, transnational corporations, to indulge in treaty shopping to avoid their tax liabilities. For instance, firms had been able to avoid capital gains tax on transactions using the Mauritius-India Double Tax Avoidance Agreement, which was signed in 1982. And it was only in 2016 that India revisited and revised this 33-year-old DPA with Mauritius, which resulted in an effective decline of FDI routed through Mauritius to India by 55% in 2018 compared to 2017. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Biani, for these very pertinent remarks. Now let me invite Mr. Antonio de Leon Salvador of the Third World Network. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Antonio Salvador. I'm from Third World Network, which is a member of the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. We're very much interested in the taxation of the digital economy. Because of the nature of the business, particularly the nature of services being provided, some non-resident companies, while making huge profits in certain jurisdictions, are not subject to tax on corporate income there, since they do not have what's called a permanent establishment there, or in the absence of a tax treaty, they are not considered as engaged in doing business in that jurisdiction. This often constitutes considerable foregone revenues, apart from the fact that resident companies are placed at a disadvantage since they pay corporate income tax even as both the resident and the non-resident companies operate in and obtain profits in the same jurisdiction. Considering the nature of the digital economy, there is then a need to revisit the following concepts. Number one, the concept of a permanent establishment. Number two, the concept of engaged in trade or business. And number three, in relation to number two, effectively connected income. However, even if these are done, there would then ensue an issue as regards the allocation of expenses in the different jurisdictions. Perhaps as an alternative, digital companies should be taxed in those jurisdictions in the form of tariff or withholding tax that is imposed by the country where the buyer, client, or customer is located. One problem, however, is that at the WTO level, there is a proposal to make permanent the moratorium on tariffs on digital trade. In the meantime, while there are discussions at the international level, countries should not be prevented from unilaterally imposing tax in whatever form on digital transactions. Furthermore, any agreement at the international level should only be in the form of a minimum tax rate, the different legislative branches of the different countries thus maintaining the right to levy higher taxes as they seem fit. Finally, we want to mention that there is, however, a need for a multilateral democratic mechanism to master the political will and decisive action to combat illicit financial flows, profit shifting, and the race to the bottom. We recognize that this is a global challenge that cannot be solved by nation states individually. Addressing this challenge can be done through a transparent, inclusive, and democratic intergovernmental body under the auspices of the United Nations, where all countries can participate on equal footing without undermining the state's sovereign right to tax, which right is exercised by the people through their respective legislatures, parliaments, and congresses. Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antonio de Leon Salvador, for your insights and remarks. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Bibusan Bista, the CEO at Young Innovations Company. Over to you, sir.
Many thanks for having me as a speaker in this panel, in this interesting discussion, Mr. Chair. And by way of introduction, I'm Bibushan Bista. I'm working in Nepal, heading a technology company that works at the intersection of how technology can be used to improve governance, public financial management, transparency, and accountability regime within Nepal and outside. So the reason that I wanted to speak here is based on our experience and having gone through the interim report of this FACTI panel, what we see is that within the larger context of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity, several pertinent issues have been raised and addressed in the interim report. And as an advocate for fiscal transparency in countries like Nepal, I'm really, really happy the way the panel has advanced these agenda. But based on our experience, one thing that I would want to bring it to the attention of the panel members here is the issue around public procurement. In countries like Nepal, and for that matter, it's just not in Nepal, but again, different countries that we have worked personally and that we have seen cases, we see that in countries like Nepal, for example, the way public procurement is planned, executed, and terminated are so many times the source of illicit financing. Public procurement projects many a times are designed to favor certain groups and individuals that benefit certain political masters and thereby become the sources of corruption, illicit finances, tax evasions, and other nuances that have been considered by the panel as well. So in this context, since we come from the background of working with the government systems on technology and all, one thing that I would want to highlight is the transparency of public procurement. So we think transparency is the key. Transparency not just on the results of public procurement, but on the entire process, right from the start. The way public procurement projects are planned, the way they are executed, and the transparency in the entire workflow is very, very critical. How projects are planned, how the specifications are designed, and is the specification favoring certain group. Those are the things that needs to be made transparent so that we can address the issue of public procurement. This is where we call for national governments and other tiers of the governments in countries like Nepal to adopt transparent mechanism to make public procurement data available in public domains so that people at least have an opportunity to see whether there are any nuances happening in the process. Right now, since the data is not available in a format that can be accessed anytime by anyone, the engagement part is totally missing. And that, Your Excellency, is maybe an opportunity for illicit financial flows through public procurement. This is where we encourage the panel to consider the transparency of public procurement process, including the use of modern approaches like open data, having a concrete data standard, and use of appropriate technology to ensure transparency of public procurement. This transparency would then help us achieve a regime of accountability and address issues like corruption and illicit financial flows that are related to larger public financial management reform agenda. Also, last but not the least, I also want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about how the corruption is treated, right? The way corruption is treated, for example, through the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption needs, in our opinion, that needs to be updated a little bit to accommodate newer concepts around data, technology, and standards. The way we track corruption, the way we look at the issues of corruption needs to embrace newer technologies, newer approaches that could facilitate the entire process of combating against corruption and thereby addressing the issues of illicit financial flows and addressing the entire regime of fiscal transparency and accountability. This is where I really thank the panel for giving this opportunity to talk about our experience from countries like Nepal. Thank you very much.
No, we are the ones who thank you for your remarks, Mr. Bista. So let me now thank you all for the valuable inputs that were provided. I am convinced that they will inform the panel's focus as we scale up towards ambitious and achievable recommendations. At this time, I want to see if our Asian FACTI panel members would like to make some concluding observations. So would any one of you like to take the floor? Mr. Shahid Karla or Mr. Karim Daher?
I would like to, thank you, Chair. I'd like to just make two quick points. I think from what I've heard throughout the day, I think let us not forget that national governments cannot be absolved of their primary responsibility to generate adequate resources to achieve these SDG targets. I fully recognize that something has to be done globally as well, but there is that responsibility of national governments, and let us not forget that part and dilute that importance. Now, a whole range of reforms will need to be carried out in the home country to fulfill its commitments, which is tax reforms, modifying spending priorities, improved, regulatory frameworks, checking of capital outflows, and so on and so forth. Secondly, and more importantly, and I think this is what I wanted to emphasize right at the end, I think we will all agree that social pressures, especially from the youth, today are building up both domestically and globally, demanding greater transparency and accountability of government. So in a sense, it is facilitating the creation of circumstances for developing broader and deeper international coalitions. I genuinely believe that because there is this feeling that there needs to be greater transparency, accountability of governments, institutional structures and formal mechanisms for the active participation of the citizenry in governance, and a more equitable distribution of the benefits of global economic prosperity. And I think this is perhaps, in one sense, an opportune time. COVID-19 has also helped create this environment to actually develop much broader coalitions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mayaki, may I?
Thank you very much.
Formulate?
So please, over to you, Karim. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mayaki. I would like to formulate a quick observation concerning what Mr. Bista has highlighted concerning the public procurement. I fully agree with him, and we should take into consideration the fact that in order to strengthen public revenues and resources for the SDG goals, there is also an effort to be provided at the level of the waste of resources, and the public procurement is one of the main elements that permits this kind of waste of resources, because all the illicit financial flows are we find several issues and several examples of illicit financial flows in the public procurement. But what is very important at this level, that all the countries that are addressing this problem are addressing the problem from the public service channel, and they are implementing laws highlighting the needs to provide or to establish a code of ethics or sanction regimes for the public servants. But what they have left aside is the fact that we find the corruption in illicit financial flows and the bribes at the level of the private sectors. And this is why an effort should be provided and made at the level of the private sector, of the corporations and the entities that are provided or are granted those kind of projects, and should be controlled, and something should be made not to accept those corporations at the level of any grant of concession or project, unless they undertake and they commit to provide the state with a permanent and periodic reports from their auditors or from their internal management, certifying that they are applying the code of ethics at the level of those companies, that are applying deep in-depth control of the audits of the company in order to discover any loophole, or to discover in any way if there are funds that are transferred and they are connected to any case of corruption. And this is very, very important in practice, because we are addressing those issues in several situations, and the private sector should not be left aside in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you very much, Shahid. We will prepare a meeting summary and we will publish it on the FACTI website in due course. But I've been very much impressed by all the comments that were provided, all the analysis that were made, which did reflect a sound assessment of our interim report. We know that the main reason for which the FACTI panel was established was due to a better financing of the SDGs, of the Agenda 2030, in order to limit the draining of resources. Second point is that we have a current institutional architecture, we have existing frameworks, but this architecture and these frameworks have loopholes. So the issue is to tackle the loopholes and target recommendations that are technically feasible, politically viable, without duplicating with what exists. But we need to be bold so that change can happen. And my third point is about a deeper international cooperation, as Shahid was mentioning. I think this is extremely important. Multilateralism needs to play a very important role in tackling these issues. It is true that there is a national responsibility, but we are facing a global problem which need global responses where national governments do provide their particular and specific contribution. And lastly, it does have an impact of people and the rights of people and the increased inequalities that we can observe, especially in a post-COVID world. So all in all, I am extremely impressed by all the remarks, the contributions that were made. I would like to thank our keynote speakers, thank the panelists who contributed to creating a conversation setting, and all our distinguished participants. So and particularly would like to also thank ESCAP and the Executive Secretary of ESCAP. So I welcome all of you to continue to engage in the panel's future activities. We are accepting, as I said already, written submissions from all stakeholders until the end of November, and we really encourage you all by building on new support and active engagement. I'm convinced that we can achieve a positive outcome with our final report and the recommendations to be published in February 2021, so that we create a greater sense of ownership of the recommendations that will emerge. So let me conclude by also wishing you success to all efforts to control the spread of COVID-19 and address the economic consequences of a pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.